I want to begin by talking about an episode from the TV series The West Wing. The West Wing is the story of a fictional president, if you've not seen it, called Jed Bartlet. And there's this one powerful scene in the second series that sticks very much in my mind. Bartlet's presidency is under pressure. His close friend has been killed in a car accident. Another friend has been shot in a terrorist incident. And other things are frustrating Bartlet. And he's in the National Cathedral in Washington. And it all boils over. And he turns his anger and his rage towards God. Listen to what he says. "She bought her first new car and you hit her with a drunk driver. What? Was that supposed to be funny? I think you're just vindictive. What was Josh Lynham? A warning shot? There's a tropical storm that's gaining speed and power. They say we haven't had a storm this bad since you took out that tender ship of mine in the North Atlantic last year. 68 crew dead." And he goes on to list other tragedies. And you feel that the pain and the anger welling up inside him. And then Bartlet cries out, "Am I to believe these things from a righteous God, a just God, a wise God?" It's a scene that has stuck in my mind because it so captures the raw pain, the raw confusion we feel in the face of suffering. And with coronavirus, it's something that many of us are feeling at the moment, isn't it? Albeit in very different ways. There's the actual pain of having the virus. There's the isolation, the sense of loneliness, being cut off from others. And then there's all that uncertainty about what the future will hold for jobs and the economy and our security. But the worst of this crisis is the ultimate cost of it all, isn't it? The numbers who are dying. And the many thousands who are left behind, grieving the loss of those that they love. I was listening to the radio a few weeks back now, and a mother of two was talking about her husband who contracted COVID-19. He became unwell and he was taken into hospital. And his wife talked about how things got gradually worse and worse with his condition, and she was sat at home waiting for the phone call, dreading the news. Eventually the hospital did ring, and they rang to say that she and her two daughters could come and see her husband for one last time. They would have 10 minutes, and they would have to be dressed in the full PPE gear. It was heartbreaking to listen to. And you think in all of this, don't you? If there is a God, why would he do this? Why would he let this happen? And for many, it's too much. They find it too hard to reconcile suffering in this world with the existence of God. Am I to believe these things from a righteous God, a just God, a wise God? And people answer no, because no such God exists. But here's the thing, I'm not sure that answer gets us anywhere. In fact, I think removing God, saying suffering is proof that God does not exist. In some ways, it makes the problem of suffering even worse. We're going to think about that in our first point. Suffering doesn't make sense without God. Now, if we say there is no God, then it seems to me that it's hard to make sense of suffering, or at least it's hard to make sense of the way we respond to suffering. Let me try and explain. There's something in each of us, isn't there, which recoils in the face of suffering. When we see pain and when we see tragedy, our instinct to say is it's wrong, it is evil when those kind of things happen. It shouldn't be the case that cancer snatches someone I love. It should not be the case that a child dies in infancy. It shouldn't be the case that millions around the world struggle to get enough food. There is something wrong when those things happen. There's something unjust about them. But if there is no God, on what grounds can I say that those things are wrong? If all there is matter, motion, time and chance, if all there is are the blind forces of natural selection and survival of the fittest, then you could argue the weak dying due to illness or disease, or the strong overcoming the weak in violence and murder, that isn't wrong. It's perfectly natural. Nothing has gone wrong when those kind of things happen. The person who has put this view most clearly is the biologist Richard Dawkins. He writes, "In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." You see, if you take God out of the picture, if the universe is nothing more than matter, motion, time and chance, then suffering is what we should expect. It has no meaning. It is neither good nor bad. It's just natural. It's just the world being the world. Atoms being atoms. In a universe without meaning or purpose or design. But the trouble is, suffering does not feel normal or natural. In the face of suffering, every fibre of our being says it should not be this way. Back in 2015, there was a number of high-profile figures who sadly lost their life to cancer. People like David Bowie, Alan Rickman and Terry Wogan. And after the death of David Bowie, the journalist Hugo Rifkin tweeted a response. And about cancer he said, "Don't just be sad, be angry." Do you see, we get angry with cancer, we get angry with suffering, we respond to it like we would respond to a crime or an injustice. It feels wrong. And like every injustice, we feel as though we should fight against it. The Welsh poet Dylan Thomas put it very powerfully. After he watched his father die, he wrote perhaps his most famous poem. Listen to the opening verses. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." And my concern is that atheism cannot account for that reaction. Now don't mishear me, I'm not saying that the atheist doesn't weep and rage against suffering. I'm saying the opposite. When faced with the death of someone we love, whatever we think about God, we react the same way. We hate it. But more than that, we feel it is wrong. My point is this: is that reaction to suffering consistent with a worldview that excludes God? If there is no God, then death, suffering and illness, they aren't wrong things. They aren't evil things to get angry at. They are just the natural and meaningless outworkings of a universe that has no design and no purpose. You see, I don't think suffering, or at least our reaction to it, makes sense in a world without God. But then if you bring God back into the picture, well, then our reaction becomes more understandable. See, God didn't create the world to be this way. The Christian story tells us that he created the world good with a fabric of righteousness and justice. He created us with a sense of what is right and fair and good. And when we see the opposite of those things, when we see suffering, we know deep down that something is wrong, that life should not be this way, because that is how God made us. We see it so clearly in the life of Jesus. As you watch the way he interacts with suffering and with death, he rages against it. He gets angry in the face of death. And so here's the thing. If you take God out of the picture, how do you explain our reaction to suffering? How do you explain our sense that suffering is an evil, an injustice, and not just the natural outworkings of a meaningless universe? Andrea Diley grew up as the daughter of Christian missionaries in Kenya, and in her childhood she witnessed many tragedies. And so much so that she began to question the existence of God until when she reached her early 20s, she walked away from her faith. Suffering had caused her to doubt the existence of God. But then later she came back to believe in the Christian God, and listen to what brought her back. When people ask me what drove me out the doors of the church and then what brought me back, my answer to both questions is the same. I left the church because of human suffering and injustice, and I came back to church because of that same struggle. I realized I couldn't even talk about suffering being evil without first accepting that God is real. You see, I want to rage against death. I want to get angry with cancer and COVID-19, not just be sad that they exist. I want to fight against famine and human trafficking because they are evil. But as Andrea Diley says, you can't even talk about suffering being evil without first accepting that God is real. That's why President Bartlett in the West Wing rages against God. He doesn't rage against atoms and against the laws of nature. If that's all there is, then our rage is not justified. If we want to be angry at suffering, there needs to be a God. So let's consider the alternative view, that in a world of suffering, God does exist. That still leaves some big questions, doesn't it? If God exists, well, why does he allow the suffering? Is he not powerful enough? Does he not care enough to stop it? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, then he's probably not a God worth knowing. But what if God has reasons for allowing suffering? Well, what if an all-powerful and all-loving God, who is infinitely wiser than us, lets suffering happen because he has good reasons, even if we don't know what those reasons are? That's possible, isn't it? In our second point, I want to look at one explanation for why an all-powerful and all-loving God might choose to allow suffering. Secondly, God calls to us in our sufferings. See, what if God allows suffering because it points to a greater problem? The Christian understanding of the world goes like this. There is a God who made us and who loves us, and he is the source of all life, of all that is good and true and beautiful. It all comes from him. And he made us to enjoy life in his world with him, to engage with his world, to use our minds and our talents to take this wonderful world and make it even better. But the problem is our relationship with our Creator is broken. We have all effectively ignored the one who made us and the one who loves us. And that breakdown in relationship with our Creator has massive and profound consequences for all our lives and for this world. It means our world is broken. It isn't the way it should be. And it means that we are broken. We are not the way we should be. We don't treat people right. We are the cause of so much suffering in this world. And so one of the reasons God allows suffering to continue is because it points to this deeper problem. It reminds us that all is not right in our world because all is not right in our relationship with the God who created this world. The author C.S. Lewis put it like this: God whispers to us in our pleasures but shouts in our pains. Suffering is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And often, not always, but often that is the effect suffering has. It wakes us up to the problems in our world. It makes us look for answers. It causes us to look for God. Earlier on, we read from Psalm 88, and it's such a striking poem. The heart of the writer is laid bare. He says, I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. But listen to where the writer directs their cries and their pain. It's not to a universe full of blind and pitiless indifference. It is to God. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. In our suffering, God calls us to himself. We've seen something of that in our own country in these last few weeks. A survey in The Guardian found that 1 in 4 have tuned in to an online church service since the lockdown began, and increasing numbers have turned to prayer. Or take one of the worst examples of suffering in modern history, the Nazi concentration camps. And yet even there, people turned to God, not away from him. Viktor Frankl, one of the survivors, he described life in the camp like this: the depth and vigour of religious belief often surprised and moved the new arrival. There were improvised prayer services in the corner of a hut, or in the darkness of the locked cattle truck in which we were brought back from a distant worksite. Do you see the effect that suffering can have? It can wake us up to the fact that there is something profoundly wrong with our world and with us. And it can therefore cause us to reach out to the God, to find out why there is something wrong. And God, when we reach out to him, is not blind or indifferent to our cries. And that's our final point. God is with us in our suffering. Now, when I was growing up, I had a close friend who was in many ways very different to me. I was brought up in a middle-class home, never went without, a very stable family. But she struggled. She struggled with money. She struggled with parents. They divorced when she was young, and life was difficult for her. By the age of 18, she had a young baby. She was living on her own, and she was trying to work to earn a living. And I went round to see her, and I said something like, I know how hard it must be for you right now. And she rightly said back, what would you know? What would you know? It's easy to think the same about God, isn't it? As we suffer down here, he's up there, pain-free, problem-free. How does he understand our suffering? It seems so callous of him, doesn't it? As he allows us to go through these things while he is kept away from them. But the unique and wonderful message of Christianity is that God didn't stay up there and he didn't stay pain-free. He came into our world as Jesus Christ and he suffered. 2,000 years ago, the historical figure of Jesus lived on this world and he did things and he said things that only God come as man could do and could say. He was God in the flesh. And in just 33 years, Jesus Christ experienced the worst kinds of suffering. He experienced poverty and genocide. He experienced life as a refugee. He wept at the graveside of a close friend. He was betrayed, he was rejected, he was beaten, and in his final moments he was left all alone to die. Jesus knows what it is to suffer. And that is a precious thing when you're in your darkest moments. One writer put it like this: we can laugh with anybody, but we cry with those closest to us. And the bond is strongest when their suffering connects to ours. With Jesus, you are never alone in your suffering. With the God of Christianity, you have someone that you can cry to and that you can cry with. He knows what it is to shed tears. He knows what it is to feel alone. He knows what it is to experience the excruciating physical pain of a broken body. He is someone you can cry with. But more than that, after 33 years, Jesus died a terrible death on a cross. And it looked like evil and suffering had overcome even Jesus as he hung there lifeless. But Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose again, and he was seen physically and truly alive by countless eyewitnesses. And in overcoming death, Jesus shows us that God will overcome all suffering. Death and suffering could not keep its hold on Jesus. During the Balkans conflict, a cellist called Vedran Smailovic was living in Sarajevo, and on the 26th of May 1992, 22 people were queuing up for bread, and they were killed by a mortar bomb. In response, Vedran Smailovic took his cello and played in the bomb crater for 22 days as a memorial. And it was such a powerful contrast between how the world was, the bomb crater, death, destruction, and how the world should be, the peace and tranquility of the beautiful music that he played. Jesus' resurrection from the dead serves as an incredible contrast between how the world is broken by suffering and how the world will one day be. His resurrection is the beautiful music in the bomb crater. It's the promise and proof that death and suffering will not win in the end. It's the promise and proof to anyone who wants it, to anyone who repents and believes in him, that he can raise them from the dead as well and bring them into a world that is transformed, a world where all the suffering has gone. When President Bartlett raged against God, he finished by saying something in Latin. He said, "Cruciatis in crucem, eius in crucem," or in English, to the cross with your punishments, to the cross with you. Bartlett meant it dismissively. Basically, he was saying to God, to hell with you. But he points us to the greatest answer to suffering that the Christian has: the cross. The Christian in God, in Jesus, did go to the cross. And he went to the cross to show us that he understands our suffering, but more than that, he went to the cross to start the process of removing suffering from this world. Because through his death, he is able to reconcile us back into relationship with our Creator. It is that broken relationship which is behind all the suffering we experience. And as Jesus died, he reconciles us back to God if we trust in him. Now, we're all going to have to deal with suffering in our lives, and it seems to me that while a Christian cannot say too much about the why of suffering, we have plenty to say about the how of suffering. That is, how we can cope with suffering. We can point to a God who understands, who cares, and who went to a cross to overcome suffering. And we can point to a God who came back to life and showed us and gave us the hope that one day there will be a world beyond death where all suffering is removed. Thank you for spending time to listen. We are going to move into a time of questions now. And again, if you want to write some questions in, then just follow the link on the screen.